Imagine being one of the toughest men on the planet, a man who has traded punches with legends, a man who has walked through fire in front of millions of screaming fans. And then one night at an airport everything falls apart in front of a camera. That is exactly what happened to Dustin Poirier. And what came after was even messier. A UFC champion mocked him. The internet turned on that champion. And now, with a massive fight just days away, the whole sport is holding its breath. Stick around because this story has more twists than anyone expected. And by the end you will understand exactly why people are calling this one of the strangest weeks in UFC history. Let's rewind to where it all began, because to understand why this exploded the way it did, you need to understand who Dustin Poirier really is. For more than 16 years, this man built his life around one thing: fighting. He came from Louisiana, he came from nothing fancy, and he turned himself into one of the most beloved lightweights the sport has ever seen. Fans didn't just respect him, they loved him. He was the guy who beat Conor McGregor not once but twice. He was the interim champion. He was the fighter who always showed up with heart, who always gave real answers in interviews, who never hid behind a fake tough guy mask. When Dustin Poirier finally retired after his loss to Max Holloway, it felt like the end of an era. Fans said goodbye to a legend, but nobody really thought about what comes after the cameras stop rolling. What happens when a man who has spent his whole adult life training, fighting, and chasing a purpose suddenly has nothing to chase anymore? That question got answered in a way nobody expected, on Father's Day, at an airport in Atlanta. Picture it: a busy terminal, families walking through with suitcases, announcements echoing over the speakers, and somewhere in that crowd, a man who used to headline UFC pay-per-views is unraveling in front of strangers. Reports say Poirier was denied boarding because staff could see he had been drinking. Things got tense. Words were exchanged. And at some point it escalated to the level where police were called in. What followed was caught on camera, and it was not pretty. Video that later surfaced showed a visibly intoxicated Poirier, agitated, raising his voice at officers, even appearing to threaten to fight one of them before he was finally taken into custody. For a guy known across the sport for his composure, for his class even in defeat, this was a shocking scene to watch. It did not look like the Dustin Poirier the world thought it knew. Now here's the thing about moments like this. The internet does not wait for context. Clips spread fast, headlines get written faster, and within hours, Dustin Poirier arrested was everywhere. But almost as quickly as the story broke, so did Poirier's response. He did not disappear. He did not hide behind a publicist's statement. He posted publicly, in his own words, admitting that stepping away from fighting had been harder on him than people realized, and that alcohol was not the answer he needed. He said it plainly: this had already caused pain in his own family's history, and he refused to let it define his. He said he was trying to take the right steps to get his mind right. For a lot of fans, that honesty landed hard. Because here was a guy who did not have to say anything. He could have let his lawyers handle it quietly and moved on. Instead, he stood in front of everyone and admitted he was struggling. But admitting it once was not the end of the story. A couple of weeks later, Poirier went further, sitting down for a long, unfiltered conversation on a major interview podcast, the kind of long-form sit-down where there is nowhere to hide behind short sound bites. And what he revealed painted a much fuller picture of what had actually been happening inside his head. He explained that the day of the arrest was Father's Day, and that mattered more than people realized. He said the morning had actually been good. He had spent it with his own kids, and for a while everything felt fine. But as the day went on and he had to travel for work, something shifted. He described it like a cloud settling over his mind, one he could not simply think his way out of. And instead of talking to somebody, instead of pausing, he turned to alcohol. By the time it was over, he had been arrested, and in that moment, sitting in the aftermath, he wondered out loud whether he had just destroyed everything he had spent his whole life building. Then he did something that took real courage. He connected the dots to his own childhood. He revealed that his father had struggled with alcoholism for as long as he could remember, and that watching that unfold as a kid had shaped so much of how he saw the world. On that particular Father's Day, thinking about his complicated relationship with his own dad apparently triggered something heavy, something he had been carrying quietly. He was honest that he had been to therapy before, that it had helped, and that somewhere along the way, once life started feeling okay again, he stopped doing the very things that were keeping him steady. And that is often exactly how it works for a lot of people struggling silently. You feel better, you let your guard down, you stop going to therapy, you stop checking in with yourself, and then one day the same fog rolls back in, except this time you are not prepared for it. He did not try to dodge responsibility either. He was very clear that his father's struggles were not an excuse for his own actions. He said he knew, even in the moment, that drinking was the wrong move, and he did it anyway. That kind of raw accountability, paired with real vulnerability about mental health, earned him an outpouring of support. Fellow fighters, current champions, retired legends, they all came out publicly to back him. People pointed out that this is exactly the kind of honesty the sport needs more of. Especially in a world where so many fighters retire, and then quietly fall apart behind closed doors with nobody checking on them. And then, right in the middle of all that goodwill, one voice cut through the noise in the complete opposite direction. Sean Strickland. Now, if you know anything about Sean Strickland, you know he does not tiptoe around anything. He is the reigning UFC middleweight champion, a two-time title holder, known just as much for his fists as for his mouth. He has never been shy about sharing blunt opinions on basically any subject you can think of. So when Poirier's emotional interview started circulating, of course Strickland had something to say about it. But what he said surprised even people who thought they had seen every version of Strickland's chaos before. He went on social media and basically told Poirier that he was not allowed to be depressed. His logic, as he laid it out, was that Poirier was rich, loved by thousands of fans, financially set for life, and therefore had nothing real to be sad about. He compared it to something much darker, bringing up children who are literally fighting for their lives against illness, saying that they would trade anything for one more healthy day, while here was a grown, wealthy man saying he felt sad. He brushed off the arrest itself almost as a joke, framing it as something that just happens to people sometimes, telling Poirier to relax about it. For a lot of viewers, this hit like a gut punch, and not in a good way. Because Poirier had just spent 90 minutes being painfully honest about generational trauma, about a father wrestling with alcoholism, about the quiet unraveling that can happen once a career-long routine suddenly disappears. And here comes the middleweight champion, publicly telling him that his pain does not count because of his bank account. The backlash was immediate and it was loud. Fans flooded comment sections calling Strickland out, and one detail in particular kept getting brought up over and over again. People remembered a moment from a couple years earlier, when Strickland himself broke down crying on a podcast while opening up about his own traumatic childhood, growing up in a home with a father who was both physically and emotionally abusive. Fans pointed out the obvious contradiction. How can a man who once wept on camera describing his own pain turn around and tell another man that his pain is not valid? Comment after comment called it out as hypocrisy, plain and simple. Some fans went further, saying it revealed a kind of ignorance about how depression actually works, that it does not check your bank balance before it shows up. Strickland, being Strickland, did not just quietly absorb the criticism. He fired back at people calling him a hypocrite, trying to draw a distinction between his own story and Poirier's, insisting they were very different situations. He leaned even further into his stance rather than backing away from it, at one point responding to another fighter's comments about the dangers of retirement with something short and dismissive, essentially telling him the fix was simple: just stop drinking. For a few days, it looked like Strickland was going to stay locked into that position no matter how loud the criticism got. But then something shifted. Reports emerged that Strickland had actually reached out to Poirier directly, away from the cameras and the social media noise, and had an honest, private conversation with him. And whatever happened in that conversation clearly moved something in Strickland, because not long after, he posted again, this time with a completely different tone. He admitted that after actually talking to Poirier, he could see that Poirier was genuinely shaken by what he had done, not performing for the cameras like Strickland initially assumed. He said he had originally figured Poirier's emotional interview was just damage control, a way to clean up his public image after the arrest, but now he saw it differently. He apologized directly, said Poirier deserved real help, and even threw in a reference to Poirier's sponsor situation, hoping the company involved would do right by him. It was about as close to a full, genuine apology as anyone following Strickland's career could remember seeing from him. Now, here's where the story gets even more interesting, because this entire saga was not happening in a vacuum. It was unfolding during fight week for one of the biggest UFC events of the year, UFC 329, headlined by none other than Conor McGregor, making his long-awaited return to the octagon against Max Holloway, the very man Poirier lost to in his final fight before retirement. Think about that layer for a second. Poirier's career-ending loss was to Holloway. McGregor's two career-defining losses were to Poirier. All three of these men are permanently tangled up in each other's stories, and now, right as McGregor prepares to step back in against Holloway, the whole build-up gets overshadowed by Poirier's personal struggles playing out in public. Naturally, fans started wondering how the two headliners would react, especially McGregor, given his long, complicated, sometimes bitter history with Poirier. Would he pile on? Would he show support? Would he stay silent and let the fight week hype speak for itself? The tension of not knowing added another layer of drama to an already emotional week. Max Holloway, for his part, handled it with class, publicly expressing respect for the way McGregor has been willing to talk openly about mental health himself in recent years, and separately wishing Poirier well, saying he hoped the Diamond could get the help he needed and find his footing again. It was a reminder that even between rivals who have shared the cage and shared brutal wars with each other, there is often more mutual respect behind the scenes than the trash talk ever lets on. Meanwhile, Poirier kept showing the same accountability that had won people over in the first place. Reports surfaced that he wanted to personally reach out to the police officer involved in his arrest, not to complain, but to thank him for handling a tense, ugly situation with restraint and professionalism, instead of letting it escalate further. Poirier openly admitted he had not even brought himself to watch the full body cam footage yet, saying he did not want to see it, which tells you just how uncomfortable he still was with facing what happened that day. That is not the reaction of someone trying to spin a narrative. That is the reaction of someone genuinely wrestling with shame and trying to do right by the people affected. So where does that leave us right as fight week reaches its peak? You've got a legendary former champion publicly battling his demons in real time, choosing honesty over hiding. You've got a reigning champion who said something genuinely hurtful, got called out hard by an entire fan base, and then did something a lot of public figures refused to do. He actually listened and he changed his tune. You've got a former rival showing quiet class in the middle of the noise. And you've got an entire event building toward one of the most anticipated fights in years, now carrying an emotional weight that has nothing to do with punches or kicks. It's easy to watch moments like this from the outside and just see headlines. Champion mocks retired legend. Internet outrage. Apology follows. But strip away the drama for a second and what you're really looking at is something a lot more human. A guy who spent his entire adult life inside a sport built on pain tolerance, suddenly forced to face a different kind of pain, one that does not go away with a good camp and a solid game plan. A sport that talks endlessly about toughness finally being forced to have an uncomfortable conversation about what toughness actually means once the cameras stop rolling and the crowd goes home. Combat sports have always sold the image of invincibility. Fighters walk out to roaring music, they get hyped up as warriors, as gladiators, as men who feel no fear. But behind that image are actual human beings, many of whom spend their entire adult lives absorbing physical damage, chasing a purpose defined entirely by competition, and then one day, often without warning, that purpose just disappears. Retirement sounds like freedom from the outside. From the inside, for a lot of fighters, it can feel like losing your entire identity overnight. No more training camps to structure your days. No more opponent to focus your rage and fear toward. No more crowd screaming your name. Just silence and whatever thoughts show up to fill that silence. That is not an excuse for anyone's behavior, and Poirier himself never tried to use it as one. But it is context, and context matters. It's the difference between judging someone from a headline and actually understanding the full story behind it. And it's exactly why Poirier's willingness to talk about it so openly struck such a nerve with fans, because it gave a name and a face to something so many former athletes go through in private, something rarely discussed until it explodes into a public incident like this one did. As for Strickland, his initial reaction revealed something about how a lot of people still think about mental health, especially in hypermasculine spaces like combat sports. The old idea that success and money should cancel out sadness, that struggle is only valid if your life looks hard from the outside. It is a belief a lot of people quietly hold, even if they would never say it out loud the way Strickland did. And that is probably why the backlash hit as hard as it did. Fans were not just defending Poirier, they were pushing back against an entire mindset that treats depression like a luxury problem, instead of something that can affect literally anyone regardless of their bank account, their fame, or how many people love them. The fact that Strickland himself had once broken down crying about his own painful childhood only made the contradiction sting more, and it is probably part of why, once he actually sat down and talked with Poirier privately, his position shifted so quickly. Sometimes it takes seeing someone's pain up close, away from the noise of the internet, to really understand it. Now all eyes turn to the cage. UFC 329 is set to unfold in Las Vegas, with Conor McGregor returning after years away to face Max Holloway in a rematch nobody thought they would actually get to see again. The build-up to this fight was always going to be massive on its own. McGregor's comeback alone guaranteed that. But this week, the story around the event became about a lot more than just a fight card. It became about what happens to warriors once the war is officially over. It became about how a community that prides itself on toughness handles real vulnerability when it shows up uninvited. And it became, in a strange way, about redemption, both for a retired fighter trying to find solid ground again, and for a champion forced to confront his own blind spots in front of the entire world. Whatever happens inside that octagon this weekend, whichever way the judges' scorecards fall, whoever gets their hand raised, this week will be remembered for something bigger than the fight itself. It will be remembered as the week the UFC's toughest men were forced to talk about the parts of themselves that have nothing to do with punches, kicks, or takedowns. The parts that show up quietly in airports, in interviews, in late-night social media posts nobody expected. The parts that remind everyone, fighters and fans alike, that no amount of money, fame, or championship gold makes anyone immune to struggling. Not even the toughest man in the room. And maybe that is the real story here. Not who said what, not who apologized and who did not, but the simple, uncomfortable truth that got dragged into the spotlight this week. That even the people we build up as untouchable, as invincible, as larger than life are still just people. People who bleed, people who break, and sometimes people who are brave enough to stand in front of millions and admit they need help. Dustin Poirier did that. However, this weekend's, that took a kind of courage that has nothing to do with what happens inside a cage. If any of this hit close to home for you, if you have ever felt that same fog Poirier described, the one that settles in even when things look fine on the outside, please know you are not alone in that. And reaching out to someone, a friend, a family member, a professional, is never a sign of weakness. It is exactly the opposite. Let's slow down for a second and really sit with the timeline, because the order these events happened in matters more than people realize. This was not a case of a champion piling on some random headline. This was a champion responding directly to a man pouring his heart out, in real time, while the entire sport was watching. That distinction changes everything about how the moment landed. Think back to who Dustin Poirier was before any of this happened. This is a man who spent his career being known as one of the classiest fighters in the entire promotion. Win or lose, he showed up to post-fight interviews with grace. When he lost to McGregor the first time, back when McGregor was at the peak of his global fame, Poirier did not make excuses. When he came back years later and beat McGregor not once but twice, he did not gloat the way a lot of fighters would have. He credited hard work, credited his team, credited the journey. Fans did not just respect him as a fighter, they respected him as a person. That reputation is exactly why this story hit as hard as it did. It was not some troublemaker getting into hot water. It was the guy everybody trusted, the one fighter who always seemed to have his head on straight, suddenly showing the world that even he was not immune to falling apart. And that is really the heart of why this whole saga matters beyond just gossip and headlines. Because for years, the unspoken rule in combat sports has been that once you retire, you disappear from the spotlight and figure out the rest of your life on your own terms, quietly, privately. Fans rarely get to see what that transition actually looks like. They see the emotional final walk to the octagon, the tribute video, the standing ovation, and then the story ends there, as far as most people are concerned. What Poirier did, whether he meant to or not, was rip open that curtain and show everyone what happens after the credits roll. And it turns out, for a lot of retired fighters, what happens next is genuinely difficult. There is actually a pattern here if you zoom out and look at the broader history of the sport. Fighters who dedicate their entire adult lives to training camps, weight cuts, and fight week adrenaline often describe retirement as one of the hardest transitions of their entire lives, sometimes harder than anything they faced in the cage. The structure disappears. The purpose disappears. The clear, simple goal of beating the man across from you disappears. And in its place is just an open calendar and a lot of quiet. Some fighters transition into coaching, some into commentary, some into business ventures. But plenty of others struggle to find anything that fills that void the same way competition once did. Poirier's story, painful as it was to watch unfold publicly, put a spotlight on exactly that struggle in a way that 1,000 generic interviews about life after fighting never could. Now let's talk a little more about Strickland, because his reaction, and the way people responded to it, tells us something important about where the conversation around mental health in combat sports actually stands right now. On one hand, you have this loud, blunt reaction dismissing depression as something reserved only for people who are struggling financially or socially. On the other hand, you have an overwhelming wave of pushback from fans, fellow fighters, and media members, all saying essentially the same thing. That is not how any of this works. That reaction alone tells you the culture is shifting. A few years ago, comments like Strickland's initial ones might have gotten a shrug, maybe even some agreement from a chunk of the fanbase who grew up believing toughness means never admitting weakness. But this time the backlash was swift, loud, and largely unified. People are no longer willing to just accept the old "just be tough" answer to mental health struggles, even in a sport as brutal and hypermasculine as this one. It is also worth pointing out just how tangled Strickland's own history is with this exact topic. This is a man who has openly discussed surviving genuine childhood trauma, growing up watching his mother suffer under an abusive father, at one point even physically stepping in as a child to try to protect her. He has talked about this on multiple podcasts, sometimes breaking down in the middle of describing it. That is not a small thing to share publicly. It takes real vulnerability to talk about surviving that kind of household. So when the very same man turned around and told another fighter that his pain was not valid because of his bank account, it did not just look inconsistent, it looked like a genuine blind spot, one Strickland himself did not seem to notice until thousands of people pointed it out to him at once. And to his credit, once he actually had a real conversation with Poirier away from the cameras, something shifted. That matters. It would have been easy for Strickland to just double down forever, especially given how well doubling down has worked for him in the past when it comes to controversial opinions. Instead, he went quiet for a bit, apparently reached out privately, listened, and then came back with something that actually resembled reflection instead of defensiveness. That is not nothing. In a media landscape where public figures rarely admit they were wrong about anything, watching someone actually update their position after direct human conversation is almost refreshing, even if the initial comments that made it necessary were genuinely hurtful. Meanwhile, all of this drama is unfolding against the backdrop of one of the most hyped UFC events in recent memory. UFC 329 is not just another card. This is Conor McGregor's long-awaited return to actual competition, after years of retirement talk, comeback teases, and endless speculation about whether he would ever actually step back into the octagon again. For a fighter who built an entire global brand on confidence, on trash talk, on being the most must-watch personality the sport has ever produced, stepping back in against Max Holloway carries enormous weight. McGregor has spent years insisting he still has it, that age has not slowed him down, that the version of him walking out this time is somehow sharper and more dangerous than people remember. Whether that turns out to be true is exactly what fans are about to find out. And Max Holloway is no easy target to test that theory against. This is a fighter widely regarded as one of the most skilled strikers the sport has ever produced, a former featherweight champion who has fought some of the most brutal wars in UFC history and kept coming forward every single time. Holloway has already beaten Poirier in what turned out to be Poirier's final fight, closing the book on one legendary career. Now he stands across from another legend trying to prove his own story is not finished yet. The symbolism there is hard to ignore. Two icons of two different eras, tangled together by their shared history with the very man whose personal struggles dominated headlines just days before their fight. It is worth remembering, too, that Holloway has handled the entire situation with a level of grace that deserves more attention than it got. Instead of using the moment to stir up extra drama or take shots at anyone involved, he publicly praised McGregor for being willing to speak openly about his own mental health journey in recent years, calling it a genuinely respectable thing to see from someone in McGregor's position. He also made a point of publicly wishing Poirier well, hoping he finds real peace and gets whatever help he needs moving forward. In a sport that so often rewards trash talk and chaos, Holloway's quiet class stood out as a reminder that not every response to pain has to be loud to matter. As fight week rolled on, the story around Poirier kept adding layers instead of fading away, which tells you people were not just consuming this as a passing news cycle, they were genuinely invested in seeing where it landed. Reports emerged that Poirier wanted to personally thank the police officer who arrested him that day at the airport, not out of obligation, but because he recognized that officer had handled a genuinely dangerous, volatile situation with restraint. Think about how rare that is. A man in the middle of one of the most humiliating moments of his adult life, choosing afterward to reach out and thank the very person who put him in handcuffs, simply because that person did their job with professionalism instead of escalating things further. That single detail says more about who Poirier actually is as a person than almost anything else in this entire story. He also revealed something that added even more weight to the whole situation, admitting that he still had not brought himself to watch the complete body cam footage of his own arrest. He said plainly that he did not want to see it. Sit with that for a second. This is a man who has willingly stepped into a cage against some of the most dangerous strikers on the planet, who has taken punishment that would break most people, who built his entire identity around confronting fear head-on inside the octagon. And yet here he was admitting that watching a video of his own worst moment felt like more than he could handle right now. That is not weakness. That is honesty about the limits of what anyone can process at any given moment, no matter how tough they are in other areas of life. It also connects back to something Poirier said about his own father, about watching alcoholism quietly destroy someone he loved growing up, and about his fear of that same pattern repeating itself in his own life if he did not address it head-on. That is the kind of generational weight that does not just disappear because someone becomes rich and famous. If anything, fame and money can sometimes make it harder to deal with because the whole world is watching every misstep, turning private pain into public spectacle within hours. So as UFC 329 Fight Week reaches its final stretch, the story circling this event has become something much bigger than a fight poster. You have McGregor's long-awaited return, carrying the weight of years of hype and doubt. You have Holloway, calm and composed, ready to prove once again why he is considered one of the greatest strikers of his generation. You have Strickland, the reigning middleweight champion, walking away from this controversy having learned something about listening before speaking, even if it took an entire fanbase yelling at him to get there. And at the center of it all, somewhat unintentionally, you have Dustin Poirier, a retired legend who never wanted to be the center of a controversy, but who ended up teaching the sport something valuable anyway, just by being brutally honest about a struggle a lot of former athletes go through in silence. That there's a strange kind of poetry in how all of this lines up. McGregor and Poirier fought twice, and both times, the loser walked away and eventually found peace with it publicly. Now with Poirier retired and struggling in a completely different kind of fight, the entire build-up to McGregor's comeback fight has been colored by that same theme of struggle and resilience, just expressed in a totally different arena. Fighting demons outside the cage is not something UFC ever puts on a poster, but this week, it became just as big a part of the story as anything happening inside it. When fight night finally arrives and the lights go up in that arena, when McGregor and Holloway finally step across from each other after years of waiting, there will be an entire narrative sitting quietly underneath the surface of that fight. A story about a legend trying to prove he still has it. A story about a challenger trying to cement his legacy even further. And somewhere in the background, a story about a man who is not even fighting that night, but whose honesty about his own struggles ended up shaping the entire conversation heading into it. Maybe that is the lesson worth carrying out of all of this. Toughness inside a cage and strength in dealing with your own mind are two completely different things, and one does not guarantee the other. The bravest moment of this entire week did not happen in a training camp or a weigh-in stare down. It happened when a retired fighter sat down in front of a camera and told the truth about something most people spend their whole lives hiding. If you or someone you know has ever felt that same weight Poirier described, that fog that shows up even when everything on paper looks fine, please remember that reaching out for support, whether that is a friend, a family member, or a professional, is one of the strongest things anyone can do. It does not make you weak. It puts you in exactly the same category as a lot of people the world calls heroes. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.